elderly folks, or the problem of the aging population? What did I miss? There's a lot, but did I get anything correct there?
Yeah, I mean, I think in broad strokes, I think you explained it well, Brien. We have been hearing for years that as the baby boomer generation started to retire, as it aged and began to retire, there was going to be enormous pressure put on all kinds of different systems in the country. And you talked about a couple of them: the payment systems, Social Security, Medicare. It's a term that's not new to us in our field anymore, but may still be new to some out there, the idea of the Silver Tsunami. The population is graying. In Florida alone, about 1 in 5 citizens in Florida is 65 or older today. That, of course, that proportion of the population is increasing, as you mentioned at the outset.
About 20%.
Yeah, about 20%, and that number is expected to be about 25% in the fewer than the next 10 years. You think about this too. About 1,000 people a day move into Florida. A city the size of about St. Petersburg moves into Florida every single year. 1 in 5 of those folks is 65 or older. So Florida is among the most elderly states in the country by proportion. I think it's number 2. I think Maine is only more elderly, but I think that has to do with the number of people who live in Maine. And so that's going to increase. And so the problems you described, how do we care for our elders? How do we pay for that care? Who will care for them? Those are all the kinds of questions that we deal with at LeadingAge Florida. We represent the provider community. So we're the only association in Florida that represents the entire continuum of aging services. Meaning, on one end of that continuum, we represent affordable senior housing providers. So imagine this scenario. Imagine you're 65 or 70 years old, you're an extremely low income older adult, and you have no place to live.
Right.
Our members serve you. We're those folks. But we also serve assisted living communities, nursing homes, and something for which Florida is, I think, reasonably well known, and that's continuing care retirement communities, these large communities that have all levels of care on a single campus. And so we're looking at this problem from all different angles. How prepared is the infrastructure in Florida to serve what is already a very large aging population, and will only get bigger? From an infrastructure perspective, from a payment perspective, from a workforce perspective, the nursing shortage in Florida is dramatic. And we tend to think about the workforce problem as a nursing problem in aging services because those are the folks who provide direct care.
Right.
But it's a problem across the board. The administrators and CEOs of these provider organizations are beginning to retire, and the pipeline is not full. So I think you addressed a number of issues in just a few minutes there, and we're working on all of them.
And have you made any progress?
Well,
when are you going to fix all this for us?
It's funny. That's a great question too. Some days it feels like you're Sisyphus and the rock is just being pushed up a different hill. But we are making progress. So we represent, there are about 700 affordable housing providers, low-income senior housing providers in Florida. We represent about 140 of them. We are part of a broad conversation in Miami. We're actually co-hosting it next week with the Bipartisan Policy Center out of Washington, D.C., to talk about interesting concepts. Housing by itself is part of the solution. Aging homelessness, elder homelessness is a growing problem in Florida as well. But one of the ways that you keep costs down is you keep people out of the highest cost locations for getting care, the highest cost settings. So the conversation next week will be how do we provide increasing services at home in a housing environment so folks can age in place.
Right.
Overwhelmingly, if you ask seniors their preference is to age in their homes, in their communities where they have relationships and they know people.
Is it, in your estimation, how has that has occurred in the last, we'll say, 100 years in America impacted this whole business? Because it seems to me 100 years ago, people aged and they stayed with their families, right? And so in some fashion, whether it was in an agrarian setting or an urban setting, I mean, you had a mother-in-law suite, right?
Sure.
Or whatever you needed to do, but families sort of hung together. That is no longer the scenario, is it?
I think that's right. And I think when we saw the diaspora from the cities into the suburbs over the last 30, 40 years or so, we saw the separation of families. And so you're exactly right. We now have, when I first moved to Florida, I was concerned about being a person who wasn't from Florida.
Yeah.
Turns out there are a lot of people in Florida who aren't from Florida. Many of them move here to retire, and they leave their families and those social connections and those family connections in their home state. So you're exactly right. The separation of families makes the caregiver aspect more difficult. Burnout makes the caregiver aspect more difficult. Anybody who has cared for a family member with dementia, as I have, understands it's a demanding 24-hour-a-day job for which there are not sufficient resources at the moment.
And if
I don't want to get too deep into the public policy weeds on this, but the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services in Washington, D.C., only a few weeks ago released a new set of rules for participating in the Medicare program. Thousands of pages of rules and requirements. It's the most sweeping set of changes in the way nursing homes will operate since the mid-1980s. And it has nursing homes scrambling because...
Scrambling to comply, to understand?
Both.
Yeah.
To understand what's driving some of those rules, to try to understand the public policy objective that is served in some of these rules, and to comply.
As you understand it, where is the motivation for that? Where is that coming from?
I think, Brien, I do understand the motivation, and I don't take issue with it. The impulse is noble, I think, and that is that for any of us, and I have been through this, my grandmother lived in a nursing home in my home state, when we entrust our family to a provider of any sort, I think we all want to make sure that it's the highest possible quality, that all the bases are covered, that our family members will be taken care of as well as they can be taken care of. And so the way the federal government tends to try to achieve that objective is to regulate. There are rules for everything. It's interesting to note the nursing home industry is the most heavily regulated field in the country. It's more regulated than nuclear energy. It's not really even close.
Really?
And I understand the impulse. The problem is, of course, that
I mean, that may not be a bad thing, but it just is what it is.
not necessarily. It isn't necessarily a bad thing. The problem is that additional regulation doesn't always equal higher quality, but it almost always equals higher cost. And that gets to one of the points that we talked about in the first segment, that it's increasingly expensive to provide these kinds of services because providers of every stripe are trying to comply with a mountain of regulations and all kinds of other concerns as well.
One of our clients here has her mom in a local. There is no question about the fact that in the state of Florida and across the nation, we are aging as a population. Nothing breaking news about that item. It has been upon us, and it's been well documented for many, many years. The question, of course, remains and is even more intensified in current times. How we care for this older population at a national level, how do we do so individually? Because it's not just a national question as to whether Social Security funds are going to be sufficient. It also has to do with what I'm going to do with mom and whether those facilities are available, the funding available personally to be able to provide for my mom or my dad or any member of my family in a manner that meets with my expectations. That's the situation we find ourselves in. And this morning I've asked our good friend Steve Bahmer to join us. Now, Steve is the president and CEO of an organization in Florida called LeadingAge Florida. We're going to find out about his organization, and he's going to help us solve all of these problems inside of about 20 minutes. Let's welcome Steve Bahmer. How are you, sir?
I'm well. Good morning, Brien. Thanks for having me.
You know, you look great. I'm guilty of saying that to a lot of people, but in your case, it's actually true. Here you are, early morning. It's Saturday, and you just look like you're ready to, I don't know, head up to Chicago for a parade or something.
Well, you are very kind. I have 6 small children at home. They keep you spry. They make you tired, but they keep you spry. Very kind.
So you mask it well. Yeah, I get that. So let's dig in here.